The dust swirled across the barren street as Patience Weston collapsed against the weather-beaten wall of the general store, her thin fingers clutching at her stomach as it growled in protest. Ukiah, California had been her last hope, but 3 days wandering its streets had left her no better off than when she'd first arrived in the spring of 1873, with nothing but the tattered dress on her back and memories that haunted her every waking moment. The sun beat down mercilessly on the mining town nestled in Mendocino County. Once vibrant with gold rush promises, Ukiah had settled into a quieter existence, though still bustling enough that no one paid mind to yet another desperate soul at the edges of society. Patience watched through strands of her matted auburn hair as townsfolk passed by, their eyes deliberately avoiding her huddled form. She hadn't always lived this way. 22 years of relative comfort had preceded her current state: a loving father, a modest home in Sacramento, and plans for a future that extended beyond surviving until sunset. But typhoid had claimed her father last winter, and the debts he'd hidden had claimed everything else. The cousin who'd promised shelter had turned her away upon arrival, leaving Patience truly alone in a town where she knew no one. The aroma of fresh bread wafted from the bakery across the street, making her mouth water painfully. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, half an apple discarded by a child and retrieved from the dust before the horses could trample it. Patience gathered what little strength remained and pushed herself to her feet. Pride had abandoned her days ago. Survival was all that mattered now. As she approached the back door of the bakery, she rehearsed the words she would use to beg for scraps. The baker had chased her away twice before, but perhaps the late afternoon hour would find him more charitable, with day-old bread he couldn't sell. Looking for something, miss? The voice startled her so badly she nearly lost her footing. Turning, Patience found herself facing a tall man astride a chestnut mare. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he was studying her with intense blue eyes. Unlike most who looked at her these days, there was no disgust in his gaze, only careful assessment. "I was just." She couldn't finish the sentence, shame burning her cheeks despite her desperate circumstances. The stranger dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 30, with a face weathered by sun and wind but handsome in a rugged way. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but of good quality: a dark blue shirt, leather vest, and worn denim pants tucked into boots that had seen many miles. "When was the last time you ate something substantial?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his stature. Patience considered lying but found she lacked the energy. "I can't rightly remember, sir." He nodded as if her answer confirmed something, then reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a cloth-wrapped package. "Here, it's jerky and hardtack. Not much, but it'll keep you standing until we can find something better." She stared at the offered food, too stunned to reach for it. "Why would you help me?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Because I've been hungry enough to know what it does to a person." He extended the package further. "Take it. I'm Dexter Zimmerman, by the way. Most folks call me Dex." Her hand trembled as she accepted his offering. "Patience Weston. Fitting name," he commented, watching as she unwrapped the cloth with desperate fingers. "Slow down there. You'll make yourself sick eating too fast after going without." She forced herself to take smaller bites, though it required every ounce of self-control. The jerky was salty and tough, but it tasted better than anything she could remember. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman," she managed between careful bites. "Just Dex," he corrected, then glanced toward the setting sun. "I've got a place about 2 miles outside town. Small ranch I've been building up these past few years." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. I could use some help around the place. Nothing improper, I've got a spare room where you could stay, and plenty of food. Patience froze mid-bite, suspicion flaring. She'd heard similar offers before, had learned the hard way what men usually expected in return. Reading her expression, Dex shook his head. I'm offering honest work for honest pay, Miss Weston. Cooking, cleaning, tending the garden. I've been meaning to hire help anyway. His gaze held her steadily. At my table you'll never know hunger again, that's a promise. Something in his straightforward manner made her want to believe him, despite all caution. Still, she hesitated. Why would you trust a stranger in your home? I've gotten pretty good at reading people, he replied. Had to in my line of work. And what work is that? Used to be a bounty hunter. Now I raise horses and cattle, not as exciting, but I sleep better. He smiled briefly, then turned serious again. Look, I understand your caution, you don't know me, but staying here. He gestured around the alleyway. Winter's coming. It gets cold in these mountains. Patience considered her options, which were painfully few. Another night on the streets meant risking more than just hunger. The last week had taught her how dangerous desperation could make people, herself included. I can leave any time if things don't suit me, she asked, needing some assurance of freedom. Anytime, he confirmed. And I'll pay you fair wages that you can save, enough that you could move on with something to your name if that's what you decide. She drew a deep breath, silently saying goodbye to the last shreds of the proper young lady she'd once been. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Zimmerman. Dex, he reminded her, then gestured toward his horse. Calamity here can carry us both back to the ranch before dark. As he helped her mount the mare, Patience wondered if she was making a terrible mistake or finding salvation. Either way, the prospect of a meal and shelter for the night outweighed all other considerations. Hold tight, Dex instructed as he swung up behind her, his arms reaching around to take the reins. As they rode out of Ukiah, the sun setting behind the western hills painted the sky in hues of amber and gold. Patience held tightly to the saddle horn, acutely aware of the stranger at her back, a man who had offered her food when others had offered only contempt. She didn't know it then, but that ride marked the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The Zimmerman ranch appeared modest at first glance, a sturdy log cabin with a covered porch, a large barn, and several fenced pastures where horses grazed in the last light of day. But as they approached, Patience noted signs of careful attention everywhere. Flower beds lined the path to the house. A vegetable garden flourished to one side, and the buildings themselves, while simple, were well maintained. It's not much, Dex said as he helped her dismount, but it's mine, free and clear. It's lovely, Patience replied honestly, struck by the peaceful setting. After weeks of chaos and fear, the ranch's orderly quiet felt almost unreal. Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. A large main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace at one end. Two doors led to what she presumed were bedrooms, and simple but sturdy furniture filled the space. Your room's through there, Dex indicated one of the doors. It's basic, but the bed's comfortable enough. There's a washroom off the back porch. I rigged up a pump system for hot water. Not quite city plumbing, but it does the job. Patience stood in the center of the room, overwhelmed by the sudden transition. Hours ago, she'd been contemplating which alley might offer shelter for the night. Are you hungry? He asked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Yes, she admitted, but I should earn my keep. Let me cook. Dex shook his head. You look about ready to collapse. Sit. Rest. We'll sort out duties tomorrow. Too exhausted to argue, Patience sank onto a chair at the solid oak table while Dex moved efficiently around the kitchen. Soon he placed before her a simple but hearty meal of beans, bacon, and fresh bread. The aroma alone made her dizzy with anticipation. "It's nothing fancy," he apologized. "I'm no gourmet." "It's perfect," she whispered, fighting back unexpected tears. They ate in companionable silence, Patience forcing herself to eat slowly despite her body's demands. When her plate was clean, Dex offered more, but she shook her head. "Better not. It's been too long since I had a proper meal." He nodded in understanding. "There's a dress in your room that might fit. Belonged to my sister when she visited last summer, and clean water in the basin for washing up." Patience met his gaze across the table. "Why are you doing all this, truly?" Dex was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as if seeing something far away. 5 years ago, I was tracking a bounty through Nevada. Got caught in a blizzard, lost my horse, nearly froze to death. An old prospector found me, took me in, nursed me back to health. When I asked why he'd helped a stranger, he said something I never forgot. The measure of a man isn't what he takes from this world, but what he gives back to it. He refocused on her face. "I can't save everyone, Miss Weston, but I can help the person in front of me." The simplicity of his explanation touched something deep within her. "Thank you," she said softly. "Get some rest," he replied, rising to clear the dishes. "Tomorrow's soon enough to talk about what needs doing around here." In the small bedroom, Patience found the promised dress, a simple blue calico that looked approximately her size. The bed was covered with a patchwork quilt, and a basin of water waited on the nightstand. She washed as best she could, changed into the dress, and sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by its softness after weeks of sleeping on the ground. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. The day's events played through her mind like scenes from someone else's life. Caution whispered that she shouldn't trust so easily, that men rarely offered something for nothing. Yet something about Dexter Zimmerman seemed genuine in a way few people did anymore. Tomorrow, she promised herself, she would prove her worth. She would work harder than he expected, show him his kindness wasn't misplaced. And she would guard her heart carefully, because depending on others had only ever led to disappointment. With that resolution firm in her mind, Patience finally drifted into the deepest sleep she'd known in months. Morning came with the sound of activity boots on wooden floors, the clatter of cookware, and the distant whinnying of horses. For a disorienting moment, Patience thought herself back in her father's house. Then reality returned, bringing with it the memory of where she was and how she'd gotten there. She dressed quickly in the blue calico, grateful to leave her filthy old dress behind. A small mirror on the wall reflected a stranger gaunt cheeks, shadows beneath green eyes that had once been bright, auburn hair tangled beyond easy repair. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself to face her benefactor and begin earning her keep. Dex was at the stove when she emerged, turning bacon in a cast iron pan. He glanced up, a smile touching his features. "Good morning. Thought you might sleep longer." "I've imposed enough," she replied, moving toward the stove. "Please let me finish that." To her surprise, he stepped aside. "Coffee's already made. Bread's from yesterday, but still good." Patience took over the cooking, grateful for the familiar task. Her father had never employed a cook, insisting his daughter learn household skills regardless of their comfortable circumstances. Now, those lessons served her well. "What needs doing today?" she asked as they sat down to breakfast. "Well, there's the usual horses to feed and groom, chicken coop to clean, garden to tend." Dex sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "But I think your first job should be getting your strength back." "No offense, Miss Weston, but you look like a strong wind might blow you over." "Patience," she corrected him. "And I'm stronger than I look." His blue eyes studied her with that same careful assessment she'd noticed yesterday. "I don't doubt your determination, but there's time. The ranch isn't going anywhere." "I prefer to be useful," she insisted. "I can manage the indoor tasks, at least cooking, cleaning, mending." "Fair enough," he conceded. "There's certainly plenty of mending. I'm afraid housekeeping hasn't been my priority." After breakfast, Dex showed her around the property. 6 horses occupied the corral, magnificent animals that perked up at his approach. "My main business," he explained, stroking a black stallion's nose. "I breed and train them, mostly for the cavalry, some for private buyers." A small herd of cattle grazed in a distant pasture. "Just enough for our needs and to sell a few each year. Nothing like the big ranches further east." The tour continued through the vegetable garden, chicken coop, and storage shed. Everywhere, Patience noted signs of a man who took pride in his work, but who was clearly managing alone what would typically require at least 2 pairs of hands. "How long have you been here?" she asked as they walked back toward the house. "About 3 years. Bought the land after I quit bounty hunting." Dex gestured toward the distant mountains. "I'd tracked a fugitive through this valley, thought it was the prettiest place I'd ever seen. When I had enough saved, I came back." Inside, Patience set to work immediately, tackling the accumulated dust and disorder with methodical efficiency. She found mending piled in a basket, shirts with missing buttons, socks with holes, pants with torn seams. By midday, she'd made significant progress on both the cleaning and the mending. When Dex came in for the noon meal, he stopped in the doorway, surveying the transformation with evident surprise. "You've been busy," he remarked, hanging his hat on its peg. "Just getting started," she replied, oddly pleased by his reaction. "I hope stew is acceptable for lunch." "I found vegetables in the garden and meat in the cold box. Smells better than anything that's come out of my kitchen in months." He washed at the basin by the door, then joined her at the table. As they ate, Dex asked careful questions about her background. Patience found herself sharing the bare outlines of her story: her father's death, the discovery of his debts, her journey to Ukiah seeking a cousin who had turned her away. "I'm sorry," he said simply when she finished. No platitudes, no judgment, just acknowledgement of her loss. "What about you?" she asked, wanting to shift attention from herself. "You mentioned a sister, Margaret. She's married to a banker in San Francisco." A fond smile crossed his face. "She thinks I'm crazy for living out here. Visits once a year to remind me that civilized society exists, Dexter, should you ever care to rejoin it." Patience smiled at his impression of what was clearly a proper lady. "And your parents?" "Gone. Pa during the war, Ma a few years after." His expression grew distant. "They had a farm in Missouri. Nothing left of it now." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as they finished their meal. Afterward, Dex insisted on washing the dishes while Patience continued with the mending. Days fell into a pattern. Patience rose early to prepare breakfast before Dex returned from his morning chores. They would eat together, discussing plans for the day. Dex worked with the horses and cattle, repaired fences, and handled the heavy labor. Patience managed the household, tended the garden, gathered eggs, and gradually added more outdoor tasks as her strength returned. Evenings were spent in quiet companionship. Sometimes Dex read aloud from one of the books that filled a small shelf, mostly adventure tales and practical manuals, but also some poetry that surprised her. Other nights, they simply talked, sharing stories from their lives before. A week passed, then 2. Color returned to Patience's cheeks, and the hollows beneath her cheekbones filled out. The haunted look began to fade from her eyes. At night, she fell into dreamless sleep, her body no longer tense with the vigilance required for survival on the streets. She found herself watching Dex when he wasn't aware, the quiet competence with which he handled the horses, the gentleness beneath his rugged exterior, the rare but transformative smile that emerged when something pleased him. He was unlike any man she'd known, straightforward, honest, seemingly without guile or hidden motives. On a Saturday nearly a month after her arrival, Dex announced at breakfast that they would go into town. "Need supplies," he explained, "and you might want some things for yourself." First payday, after all. Patience stared at him in surprise. "Payday. We agreed on wages, remember?" He reached into his pocket and placed several coins on the table. "It's not much, but it's what I can manage for now." She looked at the money, the first she'd earned in her life, and felt a surge of pride mixed with an odd reluctance. Part of her wanted to refuse, to explain that his shelter and food were more than enough compensation. But she recognized the dignity he was offering along with the coins. "Thank you," she said instead, carefully gathering the money. "I'll use it wisely." In town, Ukiah appeared transformed from her last visit. Where she had seen only hostility and indifference before, now she noticed the cheerful greetings exchanged between neighbors, the lively commerce of the main street, children playing in the schoolyard. At the general store, Dex purchased supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, nails, and other necessities. He encouraged Patience to select fabric for new clothes and small personal items she might need. She chose modestly, still careful with money that felt precious in its newness. The storekeeper, a portly man named Mr. Jenkins, watched their interaction with undisguised curiosity. "Heard you'd taken on help, Zimmerman," he remarked while tallying their purchases. His gaze lingered on Patience in a way that made her skin crawl with its implication. "Miss Weston manages my household," Dex replied, his tone casual but with an edge that suggested the conversation should progress no further. Outside, they loaded their purchases into the wagon Dex had brought instead of riding Calamity. "People will talk," Patience said quietly as they prepared to leave town. "A single woman living in your home." "People always talk," Dex responded with a shrug. "Doesn't mean we have to listen." But as they drove back to the ranch, Patience remained troubled. She'd worked hard to rebuild her respectability, to prove herself worthy of the chance Dex had given her. The idea that townspeople might view her as something improper or worse, that they might think poorly of Dex for helping her, sat uneasily in her mind. That evening, as they unloaded the supplies, she broached the subject again. "Perhaps I should look for a position in town. Mrs. Henderson at the hotel mentioned needing help with laundry." Dex paused in his work, studying her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see more than she intended to reveal. "Is that what you want?" "No," she admitted honestly, "but I don't want to damage your reputation." He laughed, the sound unexpectedly warm in the quiet evening. "My reputation?" "Miss Weston, half the town already thinks I'm peculiar for giving up bounty hunting to raise horses. The other half thinks I'm hiding from something. I doubt having a housekeeper adds much to my mysterious persona." "It's different for women," she insisted. "You know that." His smile faded, replaced by seriousness. "I do know. But I also know you're doing honest work for honest pay. Anyone who suggests otherwise isn't worth your concern." He hefted a sack of flour over his shoulder, then added more softly, "Unless you're uncomfortable here." "No," Patience said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "I'm not uncomfortable." In truth, she was more comfortable at the Zimmerman ranch than she'd been anywhere since her father's death. The work was hard but satisfying, her employer respectful and kind. And if sometimes she found herself thinking of Dex in ways that went beyond employer and employee, well, that was her private concern. As autumn deepened toward winter, the days grew shorter and the nights colder. They worked together to prepare for the coming season, preserving garden produce, chopping and stacking firewood, ensuring the barn and chicken coop were weathertight. One crisp morning in early November, Patience woke to find the world transformed by the season's first snowfall. A light dusting covered the ground, making the familiar landscape appear magical and new. She stood on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching her breath form clouds in the cold air. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Dex's voice came from behind her as he joined her on the porch. "First snow always feels special somehow." "It does," she agreed, suddenly aware of his presence beside her, the solid warmth of him, the clean scent of soap and leather. For a moment they stood in companionable silence, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold. Then Dex cleared his throat. "I need to ride into Henderson's place today. One of his mares is foaling and he's asked for my help. Will you be gone long?" Patience asked, surprised by the small pang of disappointment she felt. "Probably overnight. It's a good 10 miles, and with the snow." He shrugged. Better safe than caught in the dark. As he prepared to leave, Patience packed food for his journey and made sure he had extra blankets. The easy domesticity of these actions struck her suddenly. How natural it felt to care for this man, to worry about his comfort and safety. "Don't wait up," Dex said as he mounted Calamity. "And keep the rifle handy, just in case. Though the only visitor likely to trouble you is old Mr. Wheeler's dog, looking for scraps." She watched him ride away, his figure gradually diminishing against the vast landscape until he disappeared around a bend in the trail. The ranch felt eerily quiet without his presence, and she threw herself into work to fill the silence. By evening, the snow had stopped, leaving about 3 inches on the ground. Patience prepared a simple dinner for herself, then settled in the main room with mending. The familiar task couldn't fully distract her from the emptiness of the house, or the occasional sounds from outside that made her jump. She was being ridiculous, she chided herself. She'd managed alone for weeks on the streets of Ukiah. Surely she could handle one night in a secure cabin. Yet as darkness deepened and the wind rose, howling around the eaves, Patience found herself increasingly on edge. Every creak of the settling house, every rustling branch against the window, set her nerves jangling. She stoked the fire higher than necessary, seeking comfort in its warm glow. When a loud thump sounded at the door, she nearly screamed. Heart pounding, she reached for the rifle Dex had left, holding it awkwardly as she approached the entrance. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer came, but another thump followed, softer this time. Gathering her courage, Patience opened the door a crack, rifle at the ready, and found Dex slumped against the doorframe, his face alarmingly pale beneath a layer of frost. "Dex?" She dropped the rifle to help him inside, alarmed by the dead weight of him against her shoulder. "What happened?" "Ambush," he managed through chattering teeth. "Thought they were. Travelers in trouble, should have known better." She helped him to a chair near the fire, horrified to discover blood soaking through his coat. "You're hurt." "Just a graze," he insisted, though his grimace belied his words. "Cold's worse. Horse spooked. Had to walk the last few miles." Patience moved with frantic efficiency, helping him out of his frozen clothes, wrapping him in blankets and putting water on to boil. When she finally managed to examine his wound, a deep gash across his left side, her stomach turned at the angry red edges, already showing signs of infection. "This needs cleaning and stitching," she said, fighting to keep her voice calm. "And you need to get warm." As she worked, Dex drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally muttering about the Evans boys and a stolen horse. Patience cleaned the wound as best she could, using skills learned caring for her father during his final illness. The stitching was crude but effective, closing the gash with neat, even sutures. By midnight, Dex's fever had risen alarmingly. Patience bathed his face with cool cloths, coaxed him to swallow willow bark tea for the pain and fever, and prayed as she hadn't since childhood. The thought of losing him, this man who had saved her life, who had shown her kindness when no one else would, was suddenly, terrifyingly unbearable. "Don't you dare leave me, Dexter Zimmerman," she whispered fiercely as she changed the cloth on his burning forehead. "Not when I'm just beginning to." She couldn't complete the thought, not even in the privacy of her own mind. Instead, she redoubled her efforts, keeping vigil through the night as the wind howled outside and the man who had become her whole world fought for his life. Dawn brought a break in Dex's fever, and with it, a measure of hope. His breathing eased, and when he opened his eyes, they were clear and focused for the first time in hours. "Patience," he murmured, his voice rough. "You're still here." Relief washed over her so intensely she nearly wept. "Where else would I be?" He managed a weak smile. "Thought I might have dreamed you." She helped him drink some broth, explaining what had happened and what she'd done for his injury. Dex listened with evident surprise. "You're quite the nurse," he commented when she'd finished. "I cared for my father during his illness," she explained, "though it did little good in the end." Dex reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite his weakness. "You saved my life." Something in his gaze made her heart flutter strangely. Flustered, she withdrew her hand. "You should rest. Your body needs time to heal." Over the next few days, Patience divided her time between caring for Dex and managing the ranch. She fed and watered the horses, collected eggs, chopped wood, and kept the house running, all while tending to her patient, who improved steadily but remained too weak for his usual activities. On the third day, as she was changing his bandages, Dex caught her hand again. "You're exhausted." "I'm fine," she insisted, though truth be told, the long days and longer nights were taking their toll. "No, you're not, but you're too stubborn to admit it." His thumb traced circles on her palm, the casual intimacy making her breath catch. "I've never met anyone like you, Patience Weston." She tried to laugh to deflect the sudden intensity between them. "A half-starved beggar-turned-housekeeper. Surely you've known more interesting people in your travels." "None with your courage," he said quietly, "or your heart." Patience pulled her hand away, suddenly frightened by the direction of the conversation, by the feelings rising within her that she'd tried so hard to deny. "Your fever must be returning. You're talking nonsense." But Dex's eyes remained clear and focused on her face. "Am I? I think we both know there's something here beyond employer and employee. Has been for some time." "I should check on the horses," she said, rising abruptly. "It's nearly feeding time." She fled the house, grateful for the bite of cold air that cooled her flushed cheeks. In the barn, surrounded by the comforting presence of the animals, she tried to compose her scattered thoughts. Dex was right, of course. Something had been growing between them, something that frightened and thrilled her in equal measure. But how could she trust it? Her father's death had taught her how quickly security could vanish. The streets of Ukiah had taught her how little charity existed in the world. And a lifetime of being a proper young lady had taught her that men's interests often changed once they got what they wanted. Yet Dex had shown her nothing but respect from the moment they met. He'd offered food, shelter, and dignity when she'd had none. He'd treated her as an equal, valued her work, encouraged her independence. And in the quiet moments between them, reading by the fire, sharing meals, working side by side, she'd glimpsed a future she'd never dared imagine. When she finally returned to the house, Dex was asleep, his features relaxed in a way they rarely were when awake. Patience stood watching him for a long moment, allowing herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with him. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it settled in her heart like something that had always belonged there, just waiting to be recognized. A week passed, and Dex gradually regained his strength. Though Patience tried to maintain her professional demeanor, something had shifted between them. Their conversations held new undercurrents, their silences a different quality of awareness. His gaze followed her movements around the house in a way that made her simultaneously self-conscious and pleased. When Dex was well enough to move about freely, he insisted on riding into Ukiah to report the attack to the sheriff. "The Evans brothers have been trouble for years," he explained as he prepared to leave. "They need to be stopped before they hurt someone else." Patience couldn't hide her concern. What if they're still watching the roads? "I'll be careful," he promised, checking his revolver before holstering it. "And I won't be gone long." True to his word, Dex returned before sunset, bringing news that the sheriff had organized a posse to track the Evans brothers. He also brought something else, a small package wrapped in brown paper, which he handed to Patience with an almost shy smile. "What's this?" she asked, surprised by the unexpected gift. "Open it and see." Inside, she found a beautiful leather-bound journal and a fine fountain pen. "Dex, I don't understand. I've seen you watching the sunset sometimes or looking at the mountains with this expression." He gestured vaguely, like you're storing it all up inside. Thought maybe you'd want to write it down instead. Touched beyond words by his thoughtfulness, Patience ran her fingers over the smooth leather cover. "No one's ever given me something so perfect." "There's something else," Dex said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Sheriff mentioned the stage line is hiring ticket agents for the new office. Said a woman with good penmanship and figuring skills would be considered. Pays better than what I can offer." Patience looked up sharply, hurt blossoming in her chest. "Are you asking me to leave?" "No." Dex's response was immediate and emphatic. "God, no. I'm offering you a choice. You've rebuilt your strength, saved some money. If you want a different life, one in town with regular hours and people around, I won't hold you back." The hurt transformed into something warmer as she understood what he was doing. Not pushing her away, but ensuring she stayed because she wanted to, not because she felt trapped by circumstance. "And if I choose to remain here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dex moved closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then I'd be the happiest man in Mendocino County." He paused, then added softly, "But I want things to change between us." Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "Change how?" Instead of answering with words, Dex leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that left room for her to pull away. Patience didn't pull away. She leaned into him, returning the kiss with all the feelings she'd kept buried since that first day on the streets of Ukiah. When they finally parted, both breathless, Dex rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for months." "Why didn't you?" she asked, dizzy with the newness of being held in his arms. "Didn't want you to think it was what I expected in return for helping you." His hands moved gently up and down her back, as if reassuring himself she was real. "Needed you to know you had choices." Patience smiled, feeling truly free for the first time in longer than she could remember. "I choose you, Dexter Zimmerman. I choose this life, this place, this work. All of it." The first heavy snowfall came in early December, blanketing the landscape in pristine white. Inside the cabin, warmed by a crackling fire, Patience sat at the table writing in her journal while Dex repaired a bridle. "I rode out to the North Ridge today," he said, looking up from his work. Snow's deep, but the view was worth it. You could see all the way to the coast. Patience smiled, still adjusting to this new dimension of their relationship, the easy affection, the shared plans, the sense of building something together rather than merely existing alongside one another. "I'd like to see it," she replied, setting down her pen. "Perhaps when the weather improves." Dex seemed to consider something before speaking again. "I was thinking, that ridge would be a good place for a house." She looked at him questioningly. "A house? Something bigger than this cabin?" "Room for a proper library, maybe." He kept his eyes on the bridle, though his movements had stilled. "Room for a family, eventually." Patience's heart skipped at the implication. They hadn't spoken directly of marriage, though their deepening relationship certainly pointed in that direction. "Are you asking me something, Dex?" she prompted gently. He finally met her gaze, a vulnerability in his expression she'd rarely seen. "Not yet, but I want you to know I'm thinking about it, about us, and what comes next." She crossed the room to him, taking the bridle from his hands and setting it aside before settling onto his lap. "I'm thinking about it too." Their kiss was unhurried, filled with promise and a growing certainty about the future they would build together. Christmas approached, bringing with it preparations that filled the cabin with warmth and fragrant pine boughs. Dex hauled in a small tree, which they decorated with paper stars and ribbons. Patience baked using precious ingredients saved for the occasion: cinnamon and nutmeg, dried fruits, and the last of the summer's preserves. On Christmas Eve, they sat before the fire after a simple but festive dinner. Outside, snow fell in gentle flurries, adding to the already substantial accumulation. "I have something for you," Dex said, reaching into his pocket. "Wanted to wait until tomorrow, but I'm not sure I can." He handed her a small box wrapped in brown paper tied with a red ribbon. Patience unwrapped it carefully to find a velvet jeweler's box within. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it to reveal a simple gold ring with a small pearl set in the center. "It was my mother's," Dex explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Pa gave it to her when they had nothing but dreams and hard work ahead of them. Seems fitting." Patience looked up at him through tears that blurred her vision. "Are you asking now?" Dex took her hands in his, the ring box nestled between them. "Patience, Weston, when I found you that day in Ukiah, I told you at my table you'd never know hunger again. What I didn't know was how you'd fill a hunger in me I hadn't even recognized, for companionship, for purpose, for love." He drew a deep breath. "I'm asking you to be my wife. To build a life with me that's as sturdy as this land and as boundless as that view from the North Ridge. I'm asking you to let me love you for all the days we're given on this earth." Tears spilled freely down Patience's cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Dexter Zimmerman. 1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, she marveled at how far they'd both come, he from the solitary life of a bounty hunter, she from the desperate circumstances of the streets, both searching for something they'd found in each other. "When?" she asked as he gathered her into his arms. "Spring," he suggested. "When the snow melts and the wildflowers return, we can ride into Ukiah, find the preacher." Patience nodded against his chest, happiness expanding within her like the warmth from the fire. "Spring sounds perfect." Winter passed in a haze of contentment, the harsh weather doing little to dampen their spirits. They spent the long evenings planning their future, sketching ideas for the new house, discussing which crops to plant in the expanded garden, even tentatively talking about children. Word of their engagement spread through Ukiah when they ventured into town in February for supplies. Most reactions were positive, though Patience noticed a few disapproving glances from some of the town's more proper ladies. She found, to her surprise, that their judgment bothered her far less than it once would have. Mrs. Henderson asked if we'd considered a church wedding, she told Dex as they drove home, hinted rather strongly that it would be more appropriate. Dex glanced at her, a slight frown creasing his brow. Would you prefer that? I assumed something simple, but if you want, no, Patience interrupted, squeezing his arm reassuringly. Simple is perfect, just us, the preacher, maybe a few friends. His expression relaxed into a smile. Like who? I didn't think we had friends in Ukiah. Well, Mr. Jenkins at the store always asks after you, and that new doctor, Dr. Franklin, seems nice enough. His wife invited me to join their reading circle. A reading circle? Dex raised an eyebrow in amusement. You'll be hosting tea parties next. Patience laughed. Hardly. But it might be nice to have some connection to town beyond just buying supplies. As March arrived, bringing with it the first tentative signs of spring, preparations for the wedding took on greater urgency. Patience sewed a new dress from fine blue fabric Dex had ordered specially from San Francisco. Dex cleared land on the North Ridge, marking the boundaries of where their new home would stand. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in gold and purple, Dex brought up a subject they'd skirted around. I never asked about your family, he said. Besides your father, I mean, is there anyone who should be at the wedding? Anyone you'd want to contact? Patience was silent for a long moment. My mother died when I was 10. There were aunts and uncles, but they lived back east. We weren't close. She hesitated, then added, the cousin I came to Ukiah seeking, she made it clear she wanted nothing to do with me. Dex's arm tightened around her shoulders. Her loss. What about your sister, Margaret? Will she come? Sent a letter when the winter storms let up. Haven't heard back yet. He chuckled softly. She'll probably be scandalized that I'm marrying a woman I've known less than a year. Is that too soon? Patience asked, a flicker of doubt surfacing unexpectedly. Dex turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I've spent my life reading signs, tracking men across wilderness, judging horse flesh, deciding whether to trust a stranger's word. Never been more certain of anything than I am of you, of us. The simple certainty in his voice banished her momentary hesitation. Nor I of you. April arrived with an explosion of wildflowers across the valley, and the wedding date set for the 3rd Saturday of the month. 3 days before the ceremony, an unexpected visitor arrived at the ranch, a well-dressed woman who descended from the Ukiah stagecoach with the air of someone used to commanding attention. Margaret, Dex said when he spotted her, his surprise evident as he hurried to help her down. You didn't write that you were coming. And miss my only brother's wedding. What kind of sister would I be? She embraced him warmly, then turned curious eyes toward Patience, who stood uncertainly on the porch. And this must be the brave woman who's agreed to take you on. Patience stepped forward, suddenly self-conscious of her work dress and loosely braided hair. Patience Weston, madam. It's a pleasure to meet you. Margaret's assessment was swift but thorough, her expression softening as whatever she saw apparently met with approval. The pleasure is mine, Miss Weston. Dexter's letter spoke very highly of you, though he neglected to mention your beauty. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a whirl of activity, with Margaret proving herself a surprisingly practical and helpful presence despite her city ways. She and Patience formed a tentative but warm relationship, finding common ground in their affection for Dex and their shared interest in books. On the morning of the wedding, Margaret helped Patience dress in her new blue gown, arranging her auburn hair in an elegant style adorned with white wildflowers. You make a lovely bride, she said, stepping back to admire the effect. And more importantly, you make my brother happier than I've ever seen him. Tears threatened to spill from Patience's eyes. I never expected any of this. A year ago, I had nothing, no home, no family, no future I could see. Margaret squeezed her hands gently. And now? Now I have everything, Patience whispered. The ceremony took place on the North Ridge, just where the foundation for their new home had been marked out. Reverend Phillips from the Ukiah Church officiated, with Margaret, Dr. and Mrs. Franklin, Mr. Jenkins and his wife, and a few of Dex's business associates in attendance. As Patience walked toward Dex, wildflowers in her hair and hands steady on the bouquet Margaret had arranged, she marveled at the journey that had brought her here from desperate hunger on the streets to this moment of profound fullness. Dex watched her approach with wonder in his eyes, as if he too could scarcely believe the path that had led them to each other. "Dearly beloved," the Reverend began, his voice carrying across the ridge with surprising strength. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Dexter Zimmerman and Patience Weston in holy matrimony. The vows were traditional, the rings simple gold bands. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Dex's kiss was both tender and promising, sealing their commitment before God and the gathered witnesses. Later, after a celebratory meal at the ranch and the departure of their guests, husband and wife stood once more on the porch, watching night descend on their valley. "Happy, Mrs. Zimmerman?" Dex asked, his arm secure around her waist. "Completely," Patience replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though I'm still getting used to the name." "You've got time," he murmured against her hair. "A lifetime." As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue sky, Patience reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of despair to the height of joy, from hunger to abundance in every sense. "What are you thinking?" Dex asked, noting her contemplative expression. "I was remembering that day in Ukiah," she said softly, "when you found me behind the bakery. Best day of my life, though I didn't know it then." She turned in his arms to face him. "You told me at your table I'd never know hunger again. And have I kept that promise?" he asked, his eyes intent on hers. "That and so much more," Patience whispered before rising on tiptoes to kiss her husband beneath the vast, star-strewn sky. Spring blossomed into summer, and with it came the steady progress on their new home. Dex had hired men from Ukiah to help with the construction, but he oversaw every detail himself, often working alongside them from dawn until dusk. Patience divided her time between managing the existing ranch and planning for the expanded one. The vegetable garden doubled in size under her care, and she added fruit trees along the southern fence, apple, pear, and cherry saplings that would take years to mature, but represented their commitment to the future. Margaret had returned to San Francisco, but wrote regularly, her letters filled with news of the city and barely disguised hints about starting a family. Patience smiled each time she read her sister-in-law's not-so-subtle suggestions, though she and Dex had already begun to hope for children of their own. By August, the frame of the new house stood complete on the ridge, its silhouette visible from the cabin. 2 stories with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, it would have 4 bedrooms, a study for Dex, and the library Patience had dreamed of since childhood. "Big enough for all those children Margaret keeps mentioning," Dex teased one evening as they stood surveying the progress. Patience laughed, leaning against his shoulder. "She's persistent, I'll give her that. Must run in the family," he replied, dropping a kiss on her head. "Once we Zimmermans set our minds to something." The passing months had only deepened their connection, the initial rush of romance maturing into something more substantial, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a love that continued to surprise them both with its intensity. They had disagreements, of course. Patience was more cautious with money, preferring to save for leaner times, while Dex sometimes made impulsive purchases he felt would improve the ranch. She preferred quiet evenings at home, while he occasionally yearned for the sociability of town. But they learned to navigate these differences with honesty and compromise, each valuing the other's perspective even when they didn't share it. As autumn approached, bringing cooler temperatures and the harvest season, Patience began to suspect what she'd been hoping for. Her monthly cycle, regular as clockwork since she'd regained her health, was late. Her dresses felt tighter around the waist, and certain smells, particularly coffee, which she usually loved, turned her stomach. She waited until she was certain before sharing the news with Dex. On a crisp September evening, as they walked among the golden aspen trees that lined the creek, she took his hand and placed it gently against her still flat stomach. "We'll need that nursery sooner than we thought," she said softly, watching his expression transform as understanding dawned. "A baby," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. When she nodded, he let out a whoop of joy that startled birds from nearby trees, then lifted her in a gentle spin that made her laugh despite the momentary queasiness. "When?" he asked when he'd set her down again, his hands cradling her face as if she were made of the most precious porcelain. "Early spring, Dr. Franklin thinks. March, perhaps." Dex kissed her then, pouring all his happiness and love into the gesture. When they parted, both breathless, he pressed his forehead to hers. "Thank you." "For what?" she asked, smiling at his intensity. "For everything. For staying that first day, for healing me when I was hurt, for becoming my wife." His voice caught slightly. "For carrying our child." Patience blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the journey they'd taken together. "I should be thanking you. You saved me, Dex, in every way a person can be saved." He shook his head, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We saved each other." The news of the pregnancy lent new urgency to completing the house before winter set in. Dex pushed the workers harder, often staying late into the evening to finish tasks himself. Patience worried about him overtaxing his strength, but understood his determination to have their new home ready. By November, the house was habitable if not entirely finished. They moved in just before the first significant snowfall, carrying their few possessions from the cabin in several wagon loads. The new rooms echoed with emptiness, waiting to be filled with furniture, books, and the accumulated treasures of a shared life. "It still needs work," Dex apologized as they stood in the empty library, its shelves bare except for the few books they already owned. "Curtains, more furniture, proper rugs." "It's perfect," Patience assured him, imagining the room filled with light and books, perhaps a child playing on the floor while she read aloud. "We'll add to it over time." As winter settled over the valley, they established new routines in their expanded home. Dex converted part of the old cabin into additional space for his horse breeding business, which had grown steadily more successful. Patience set up her kitchen with efficient care, though cooking for just the two of them in the large space sometimes felt strange after the cozy confines of the cabin. Christmas that year was especially meaningful, their first in their new home, their first as expectant parents. They decorated a larger tree than the previous year, placing it in the front window where its lights could be seen from the road. Margaret arrived 2 days before the holiday, bringing trunks filled with gifts from San Francisco, delicate china, fine linens, and an exquisite cradle that had been in the Zimmerman family for generations. "For the newest member of the family," she explained, running her hand over the smooth wood. "You were too small for it, Dexter, but our father and his father before him slept in this cradle." Patience traced the intricate carvings along the edge, touched by the sense of history and belonging the simple piece of furniture represented. "It's beautiful. Thank you," As the new year of 1874 began, Patience's body changed more visibly with the growing life inside her. Dex watched these changes with fascination and a protectiveness that sometimes made her laugh. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she reminded him when he insisted on carrying even the lightest load or prohibited her from venturing out in mild winter weather. "Humor me," he would reply with a smile that never failed to warm her heart. In February, a letter arrived from Sacramento that changed the rhythm of their days. Patience's cousin, the one who had turned her away in Ukiah, had died of pneumonia, leaving no immediate family. To Patience's astonishment, she had inherited a modest sum of money and a few family heirlooms, including her grandmother's silver tea service and a collection of books that had once belonged to her father. She must have felt guilty, Patience mused as she read the lawyer's letter. Though not enough to help when I truly needed it. Dex watched her carefully. "Are you sad? About your cousin, I mean?" Patience considered the question honestly. "Not sad exactly. We were never close even as children, but I regret that reconciliation wasn't possible." She folded the letter carefully. "Life is too short for grudges, I think." The unexpected inheritance allowed them to complete the furnishing of the house sooner than planned and to invest in expanding the ranch's operations. Dex purchased additional breeding stock, while Patience set aside money for the child's education and future needs. As March approached, bringing with it the anniversary of their first meeting and the anticipated arrival of their child, Patience found herself increasingly reflective. Often, she would stand at the large windows of their new home, looking out over the valley that had become her haven, marveling at how completely her life had transformed in the space of a single year. On a blustery day in mid-March, as the first crocuses pushed through the melting snow, Patience felt the initial pains that signaled the beginning of labor. Dex had ridden into town that morning but had promised to return by noon. She walked carefully through the house, gathering the items Dr. Franklin had suggested, having ready clean linens, hot water, the special tea the doctor's wife had prepared to ease labor pains. When Dex returned, he found her breathing through a contraction in the rocking chair they'd placed in the nursery. "It's time," she said simply, reaching for his hand. The next 14 hours passed in a blur of pain, effort, and ultimately, wonder. Dr. Franklin arrived mid-afternoon, his calm presence reassuring as the labor intensified. Margaret, summoned by a ranch hand Dex had dispatched to the telegraph office, would not arrive for days, having been visiting friends in Sacramento. Throughout the ordeal, Dex remained by Patience's side, wiping her brow, offering water and encouragement, his face alternating between concern and absolute faith in her strength. As dawn broke on a new day, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that filled the room with promise. "He's perfect," Dr. Franklin announced, placing the swaddled infant in Patience's eager arms after the necessary cleaning and checking. "Strong lungs, good color, all fingers and toes accounted for." Exhausted but radiant, Patience gazed down at the tiny face, a perfect blend of herself and Dex, with a dusting of dark hair and her own green eyes. "Hello, little one," she whispered, tracing a finger along his velvet cheek. "We've been waiting for you." Dex sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Patience's shoulders as they marveled at their creation. "He needs a name," he said, his voice thick with emotion. They had discussed possibilities over the winter months but had never quite settled on a final choice. Now, looking at their son's face, Patience knew. "Thomas," she said, "after my father, Thomas James Zimmerman." "Thomas," Dex repeated, testing the name. "It suits him." As Dr. Franklin packed his bag and prepared to leave, promising to return the next day to check on mother and child. He paused at the bedroom door. "You know," he said with a smile, "in all my years of practice, I've delivered hundreds of babies. But there's something special about bringing a child into a home with so much love. This little one is fortunate indeed." Left alone with their son, Dex and Patience shared a moment of profound connection not just with each other, but with the tiny life they had created and would nurture together. "I never imagined this," Patience admitted softly, leaning into Dex's embrace as Thomas slept peacefully in her arms. "Even in my most hopeful moments, I couldn't have dreamed of such happiness." Dex pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "Nor I. But perhaps that's the beauty of life, it gives us gifts we never thought to ask for." As spring progressed into summer, Thomas thrived under his parents' devoted care. The baby slept in the Zimmerman family cradle in the nursery adjoining their bedroom, though he often ended up between them in the early morning hours after his dawn feeding. Margaret had stayed for a month after the birth, helping Patience adjust to motherhood and doting shamelessly on her nephew. Before returning to San Francisco, she had extracted a promise that they would visit in the fall, introducing Thomas to the city and the extended circle of friends she considered family. The ranch prospered along with the growing family. Dex's reputation as a breeder of exceptional horses spread beyond Mendocino County, bringing buyers from as far away as Oregon and Nevada. Patience's garden flourished, providing not just for their table but enough access to sell or trade in Ukiah. They hired additional help, a young man named Charlie, to assist Dex with the horses, and a local girl, Sarah, who came 3 days a week to help Patience with laundry and heavier household tasks. The arrangement allowed Patience to devote more time to Thomas, while still maintaining the home she took such pride in. On warm summer evenings, they often sat on the wide porch, Dex smoking his pipe while Patience nursed Thomas or simply held him, watching the sunset paint the valley in golden light. "I was thinking," Dex said one such evening in late July, "about adding a schoolroom to the house." "Next to the library, perhaps." Patience looked at him in amusement. "Don't you think that's planning a bit far ahead? He's only 4 months old." "Never too early," Dex replied with a smile. "Besides, I was hoping we might fill more than one seat in that schoolroom eventually." The thought of expanding their family further made Patience's heart swell. "I'd like that," she admitted. "Though perhaps we should wait until this one is sleeping through the night before we consider siblings." Dex laughed, reaching over to stroke Thomas's downy head. "Fair enough." As autumn approached once more, bringing with it the first anniversary of their marriage, they prepared for the promised visit to San Francisco. It would be Thomas's first journey away from the ranch, and Patience's first visit to a major city since her father's death. The night before their departure, after Thomas had been settled in his cradle, Dex presented Patience with a small package wrapped in silver paper. "What's this?" she asked, surprised by the unexpected gift. "A little something to mark our anniversary," he explained. "Open it." Inside, she found a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. When she opened it, she discovered a miniature photograph of the 3 of them, Dex, herself, and Thomas, taken in Ukiah the previous month by a traveling photographer. "Oh, Dex," she breathed, tears filling her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's perfect." "Not quite," he said, taking the locket from her hands and turning it over to reveal an inscription on the back. "For PZ. At my table you'll never know hunger again. All my love, DZ." Patience's fingers traced the engraved words, remembering that pivotal moment on the streets of Ukiah, hungry, hopeless, and at the end of her endurance. How could she have known then that the stranger on horseback would become her husband, the father of her child, the center of her world? "You've kept that promise," she said softly, looking up at him with all the love she felt reflected in her eyes. "In more ways than you could possibly know." As Dex fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers lingering on the soft skin at her nape, Patience marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From desperate hunger to abundant love, from isolation to family, from uncertainty to purpose. Later that night, with Thomas sleeping peacefully, and the moon casting silver light through the bedroom window, husband and wife celebrated their anniversary in the private language of touch and whispered devotion they had developed over their time together. "Happy?" Dex asked as they lay entwined in the aftermath, his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek. "Completely," Patience answered without hesitation. "And grateful every day that you stopped your horse behind that bakery." His arms tightened around her. "Best decision I ever made." As sleep began to claim them, Patience thought of the road ahead, raising Thomas, perhaps welcoming more children, building their ranch into a legacy that would outlast them both. The future stretched before them, bright with promise and possibility. From hunger to abundance, from solitude to connection, from despair to joy, their story had unfolded in ways neither could have predicted, but both now treasured beyond measure. At his table, she had indeed never known hunger again, not for food, not for shelter, not for love or purpose or belonging. And in the years to come, as their family grew and their ranch flourished, Patience would often think back to that fateful day in Ukiah, the day hunger had led her to the man who would feed her soul for all the days of her life.